Hi, my name is Corinne Coe. For those of you who don't already know, I'm a psychologist and I have run a full-time private practice in Cleveland and Brisbane, Australia. And for those of you who haven't actually already watched my last video on anxiety, if you do suffer anxiety, it's probably worthwhile you actually going and looking at it on Facebook. I have actually posted it. So today I'm going to be talking about depression and the treatment that I actually use in treating my clients, as well as the causes, the main causes. So when it comes to depression, there is an important, like serotonin is really critically important. So there are the main happy hormones that are normally released when you don't have depression are serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. Serotonin is the main one and the most important one when it comes to feeling happy and less depressed and your mood being more positive. So when the important part is that your brain needs to produce serotonin. And while there are biological and medical conditions that may interfere with the production of serotonin, basically that may interfere with the production, and that's something that unfortunately I'm actually not qualified to talk more about, but it might be worthwhile you talking to your doctor or your specialist about that. But most of the time, production of serotonin is not an issue, and it is more an issue of releasing the serotonin. So when you might have someone who is depressed who might have quite a lot of serotonin ready to be released, but unfortunately that's not being released. So what I'm going to explain to you is why that's not happening. So I'm only going to be talking today about the psychosocial causes of the depression and the causes of not releasing the serotonin. So one of the things that you have to understand is that your mind, if you look at that, your mind is like the driver, your brain is the engine, your body is the vehicle. So if your mind is positive, and then what's going to happen is that it's going to send the signals to your brain to release the happy hormones that you need. So when those hormones are released, what happens is that you're obviously your body's going to respond in a positive way. So you're going to feel more relaxed, you're going to feel happier, and one of the things that happens though when you have depression is that, and you're not releasing the serotonin, it's often caused by negative thinking. So when you're thinking negatively, your brain is not going to receive the signals it needs to release the right hormones to make you feel good. So you're more likely for it to hold off on releasing serotonin, and what it will instead, it will actually cause you to feel more tense and feel pretty down, and it will actually affect you, all those symptoms that you normally get, like loss of motivation, loss of energy, and feeling quite negative and that. So negative thinking is really a major cause of depression when it comes to psychosocial factors and problems associated with. So a lot of my clients that I do have come in, and over the many years that I've actually treated people with depression and anxiety, I have actually noticed that there's a strong correlation between a critically low self-esteem and negative thinking and depression. So one of the things that is an important part of treatment in depression is really to develop the self-esteem in a person. Now, by self-esteem, I'm not talking about confidence, because that's completely different. You can actually be confident, highly confident. You can be an extrovert, and you can actually be quite confident in particular things, whether it's being your work or as a mother or father. And you can even be confident in a particular skill, like playing piano, guitar, writing. And so confidence is completely different to self-esteem. So self-esteem is your perception of yourself. So how you perceive yourself when you compare yourself to others. So if you perceive yourself as low and compared to others, then unfortunately you are going to have quite a lot of negative thoughts. And those negative thoughts are going to be particularly about failing. There's going to be negative thoughts about rejection, about being judged. And that's what causes, a lot of the times, what actually causes the reliance on unhealthy coping mechanism like over-pleasing and over-commitment, which unfortunately, when you start to apply over-pleasing behaviour or even perfectionism, what actually happens is that only compounds on the problem, because that's where you're not able to to screen and your relationships, and so you're more likely to accept toxic relationships, because all you're focused on is trying to impress them, trying to be accepted by them. And so sometimes that you can actually overlook the signs of a toxic relationship. A lot of my clients, also there's quite a strong correlation that I've actually seen also with people who have very low self-esteem, have also had very traumatic, dysfunctional backgrounds. So I'm talking about the dysfunctional childhood. So it might even be sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, maybe some dysfunctional relationships, also the excessive and long-term bullying. So these can actually destroy your self-esteem before it even can develop. And so once your self-esteem is destroyed, what happens is that you're going to be more likely to have, obviously because you've got this low perception of yourself, so it's you haven't developed the opportunity to, I guess, test your abilities, because what you do is you tend to stay within your comfort zone. So when you stay in your comfort zone, you tend to sort of not want to experience anything because of fear of failure. So once you've got, when you stay in your comfort zone, sometimes you may not have the opportunity to stay there, and sometimes you're actually pushed out of your comfort zone, and that, unfortunately, if it's not something you are instigating, you will actually experience quite a lot of anxiety, only to probably prove to yourself after experiencing that anxiety that you are quite capable of performing that activity or that task. So while you may not feel good at the time and you might be experiencing a lot of anxiety, you are in fact performing and completing the task successfully. So, excuse me. So one of the things that we have to do is develop that self-esteem. So because as life becomes more challenging with the phases in your life, that increases. So you might start off in childhood, teenage years, then you might young adult, and then older adult. What happens is that with each phase there's more challenges. So you've got mortgages, you've got career, university, all sorts of things, and kids that you have to accept and deal with. Now, if your self-esteem is critically low, what happens is that the more challenging life becomes, the harder it is, and the more anxiety you're going to experience. And with that anxiety, unfortunately, that exhausts you, so you end up sort of feeling even more and more depressed, because obviously you're not going to be happy when you're actually experiencing quite a lot of anxiety. So what happens is that is probably why the majority of the time I do have clients that come in at the 30 to 35 year old range, because that's when it starts to become extremely difficult to cope. So when you don't have self-esteem, your stress mechanisms and stress strategies are not in place. So the importance strategies that you actually need to deal with stress are problem-solving skills, so being more proactive in problem-solving, also being more assertive, And unfortunately, when you have low self-esteem, if there's an issue that you have to deal with someone, you're more likely to avoid, because you don't want to enter into a conflict. There might be that fear of entering into a conflict or a confrontation. It might even be, most of the time, it's because you don't know whether it's you or that person who's at fault. So self-blame is quite a common symptom also of low self-esteem. Now, when it comes to dealing with these sort of issues, the more you actually avoid, and the more problems that start to develop around you, the more that you end up having long-term stresses, the more you operate above your stress levels, and unfortunately the more depleted your resources, and that's when you might enter into a deeper level or episode of depression. So for a lot of people, low self-esteem, what happens is that they, at their best, they might be experiencing maybe mild symptoms of depression, and maybe that might be confused with as in feeling normal, but that's because your symptoms at the mild stage is not as severe or not as debilitating. So that doesn't mean that you're not in depression. It just means that when you actually experience a much more, so if you're in a job situation and you're having difficulties maybe with co-worker or the amount of workload, what happens is that when you're experiencing all of that stress, it actually then pushes you down into the next episode. And that is why for a lot of people that I do see in therapy, there's many episodes throughout their life. And if they actually have a look back at when those episodes occurred, they'll be able to recognize that there would have been a massive big change, whether it's a loss of a relationship or whether it's loss of a job or anything that was extremely challenging and stressful for them. So it's really, really important to have the right skills to deal with stress, and that is having proactive problem-solving skills instead of reactive problem-solving skills, to develop assertiveness skills, and to have those two, unfortunately, you really need to be able to have a healthy self-esteem, because you can't go and approach someone and be assertive with someone if your self-esteem and your perception of yourself is low, because what you're more likely to do is assume that it must be you who's actually causing the problem, when it may not be the case. So once you actually have your self-esteem developed and your assertiveness skills and proactive problem-solving skills, then when stresses, as they arrive and come into your life, you're able to deal with them, put them to rest, and then wait until the next stressor comes along, life stresses, because you can't avoid those. And then all of a sudden, you just keep doing the same pattern of addressing it in a proactive way, rather than avoiding and hoping that they're going to go away, or hoping that the person is actually going to change and be nicer towards you, when that may not happen. So once you've got that, then you're going to experience normal ups and downs. You're less likely to experience big dips from mild down to moderate to severe depression. So now everyone's probably heard of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. So when it comes to releasing serotonin, you have to think more accurately or positively. So it's not just a matter of actually just being positive. It's not that easy. It's about correcting the way that you are thinking. So when you're actually growing up in childhood, for example, and in a very dysfunctional environment, and you're actually being criticized, then what happens is that because you're trained to try and avoid criticism, you're training yourself to look at things more in a negative way. So you're more prone to search for negatives rather than positives. And so sometimes that can actually develop into a bad habit. But the other thing too is that when you're criticized heavily throughout your childhood, or even in later years in your life, what happens is that you're going to assume that a lot of those criticism, you've actually accepted those criticisms. So what you're doing is you've taken them on board, and that is what you're hanging on to. So if you've been criticized throughout your life for being lazy, for being useless and worthless, and you know, any criticism, what's happened is that, especially if that criticism is given by a significant person in your life, like say a parent or a teacher or an older sibling, or even a partner, an ex-partner. So one of the things that can actually happen is that when you actually hear quite a lot of criticism, you actually take that on board, and that becomes what you perceive to be who you are as a person. So when you actually think so low of yourself, then what you're going to be doing is you're not going to be comfortable in a social situation, because if you actually don't think that you've got much to offer, and you think that you've got more weaknesses than strengths, and you don't feel, you know, proud about who you are as a person, then what actually can happen is that when you go into a social situation, you're going to be anticipating the other person. You're going to anticipate that that person is actually going to reject you or judge you. And so what you're more likely to do is hold back and not actually demonstrate and show who your true personality. And unfortunately, that can actually interfere in the development of a healthy relationship or friendship. So now with self-esteem issues, the typical symptoms are a loss of fear of failure and fear of rejection. So in relationships, you're going to struggle because you're more likely to overplease. You might actually, by overpleasing, like I said earlier, keep toxic people in your life, and also you're also not going to find it very easy to cope with the you know, in a social situation and developing friendships and that. So when it comes to relationships and social life, that can actually be a bit of a problem and to develop. When it comes to fear of failure, what can actually happen is you can actually be so fearful of trying anything through fear of failure or making a mistake that you're not going to attempt anything. So if I was to go and attempt to cook or dance, and I'm going to be scared of actually being the only one in the class to not perform, then I'm more likely to not avoid it and not even try, which unfortunately doesn't actually test my capabilities. And unfortunately, without that, you cannot actually develop the skills and the strengths that you actually need to feel good about yourself. So a strength in one person can actually be a weakness in another. And just like that weakness in that person can be a strength in you. So no one has exactly the same strengths and no one has exactly the same weaknesses. So it's really important to actually attempt and try things. And I have attempted a couple of things in my life and have actually failed. And I've accepted the fact that that's just not a skill that I actually have. But if you don't attempt anything, then what's going to happen is that you're never ever going to understand and develop an identity. And when you don't have an identity, then that actually, unfortunately, you feel lost and you stay within your comfort zone, so you feel trapped. And that is what can actually contribute to depression. So with depression, if it's not a biological cause, then the psychosocial causes can actually be feeling trapped, and it can be anything that can trap you. It could be a medical condition, could be finance, could be anything, a controlling person in your life. It can actually also, but mostly it can also be self-esteem. So when you're within your comfort zone, you're not getting a sense of purpose in life, you're not getting stimulation, you're also, or not a sense of belonging, because you're not developing relationships that are healthy. So that's why it's really important to develop self-esteem and also to correct your thinking. So I'll just give you a little bit of an example of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, for those of you who are not aware of, haven't heard that term. Because what I'm actually hoping to achieve out of this talk is to provide you with enough information to be able to have direction and guidance to go and get the treatment from a therapist, or if you've already tried that at least you'll know exactly what it is that you're wanting to address. So it's about going to that therapist and saying to them, this is what I'm wanting to address, let's work on that. But CBT is cognitive behavior therapy. It's changing the way that you actually think. So if you have actually got a lot of negative self beliefs about yourself, it's probably, like I said, due to all the negative and trauma and negative criticism you've had, and that's compounded by the negative thoughts that you've also have had along the way. So when you've actually got negative thoughts, it's about looking back at these beliefs that you have about yourself and starting to look for evidence. So that is what cognitive behavior therapy is. It's about rationalizing. It's almost like having like a filter. So if someone criticizes me, for example, before I accept it as a constructive criticism, I'm going to be assessing and looking for facts, objective evidence, other than just what that person is telling me, and before I even just accept it as true. So when if I'm criticized by say my boss, for example, I'm not going to just accept that as true until I've actually filtered it. And by filtering it, what you're doing is you're analysing and collecting objective evidence. Perhaps say if I was to look at, all other areas in my life, everybody else that I've actually had dealings with, how many people have actually criticised me about the same thing. So if I've had previous employers who've actually complimented me, for example, about being organised, and this current employer might sort of be criticising me about being disorganised, then something would not be gelling. And so for me, I'd be questioning that a little bit more and asking them for examples. And most of the time, if someone can't give you an example, then often that is just what that is destructive criticism. So it's not constructive. It's meant to manipulate. It's to control. It's to get you to do what they want, basically, and to boost their ego. So sometimes, it's very, very critical that before you accept anything, whether it be your own negative thought or self-criticism, it might be a criticism from someone else, it might be a failure. You need to be assessing all of that and working out exactly, what the contributing factors are in that failure, because if it's something that you had no control over, then it's really important, to accept that failure was caused by something beyond your control. So yes, it might be a failed outcome, but it's not necessarily mean that you are a failure. So if I'm actually not being provided with the training to do my first job as a teenager, then I'm not, and I might be fired. That doesn't necessarily mean that I am a failure. It means that organisation has failed me because they haven't actually trained me for me to be able to do my job without making mistakes. So so what it is with cognitive behavior theory, it's about changing how you actually, you need to assess things before you come to a conclusion, and before accepting that is a true criticism of you, then you need to be able to collect objective evidence. And by objective evidence, I'm talking about anything that isn't about how you feel or what you think. It's about facts. So it's almost like going to court. If you're going to be in court and you say, well, I believe or I feel that this person has actually committed that crime, that's not going to be viewed as evidence. It's got to be something that's actual factual, it's tangible, it's something that's with evidence based. So, and that is what cognitive behavior therapy. Now, one of the things that is just one of the techniques. There are quite a few techniques that when it comes to building self-esteem. But what I know is that when I've actually worked with a lot of my clients in building self-esteem, in building those techniques, then what happens is that I do notice that they have a different outlook in life. They're able to deal with difficult people. They don't personalize things as much. They don't overplease. There's no overcommitment. There's no reliance on unhealthy coping mechanism. So then they start to get out of their comfort zone, and they start to put in place the things in their life that are going to give them that stimulation, that sense of purpose, and that sense of belonging by having healthy relationships. Now, when you're dealing with stresses in the right way, and when you have people in your life that value you and accept you for who you are, then that is only going to further grow your self-esteem and maintain a healthy level of self-esteem. If you don't filter anything and you just accept criticism, and what you're going to be doing is the beliefs that you hang on to that may not be accurate are going to interfere in your decision in life. So you're not going to possibly go and take that promotion because maybe what, a previous employer has actually criticized you about was that you may be not good in management, or it might not be that you're good in being organized or following through with anything. So that criticism may not have been accurate, but you've actually hung on to it and believe in it. And so that can actually then interfere in you going and pursuing that promotion. So it's the same with if I've been criticized in the past, for example, for by teachers, or I haven't actually performed well at school, then what I'm going to be more likely to believe is that I'm not capable of learning. And so that is actually going to interfere again in me pursuing, say, further education or training, even though since school I may have actually proven in other ways that I'm quite capable of learning. So it's really, really important to have an accurate perception of yourself. And there are probably a lot of beliefs that you actually have, and weaknesses that you believe that you might have, that you're hanging on to, but it's a process of actually going back to each of those and having a look what evidence supports that. So if you're, say, a parent may have actually criticized you for being disorganized, but you've never been criticized since then by anyone about that particular, then chances are that parent may have actually used that criticism to motivate you maybe to clean your room, whether it would have been at standard, a normal standard, or an unrealistic standard of theirs. It doesn't matter, but if you haven't been criticized since then I would accept the fact that I am organized. And so that's what CBT is. Now the proactive problem solving is an important part as well. So it's about not reacting to things without actually first assessing situations. So that, again, that's to do with anxiety, because sometimes anxiety can also cause depression. So it may not necessarily be a self-esteem. So if you suffer from anxiety, then I highly recommend that you look at my previous video on anxiety. And because when it comes to anxiety, that will actually obviously force you to stay within your comfort zone. And sometimes people will stay in their comfort zone, and by staying in their comfort zone, that means that they're actually obviously not living the life that they want to live, and so that can actually cause them depression. But then when they step out of their comfort zone, they're going to experience anxiety. And so sometimes, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So it's about, like I said, addressing the cause. So one of the main causes, like I've said, is self-esteem. Now, one of the books that I actually have written is Heal Your Mind, Heal Your Life. It's probably back to front, so that does say Heal Your Mind, Heal Your Life. But if you recognize the blue butterfly, the book is specifically written for self-esteem development, and it is specifically to address depression. So if any of you actually can relate to anything that I've actually said in this video, then I highly recommend that you either go on YouTube and start to look at YouTube videos on developing self-esteem, and also maybe reading books on developing of self-esteem, go and see a therapist, psychologist, and with your goal of wanting to address self-esteem, not and take control of the therapy session by saying this is what you're wanting to address. And if they're not able to address it, then keep looking for another therapist that will be able to do that. So the book, like I said, my book is available on Amazon as an ebook or as a print version, and it is available at the moment at a discount. So if it does actually have all the strategies that I typically use in addressing depression and treating depression for my clients. So I hope that you've enjoyed the video, and look forward to feedback. I will be also doing my next video on post-traumatic stress disorder. That will be in a couple of weeks. And if you know someone who has, I will be posting this video on Facebook. So if you know someone that is suffering from depression that might be find this helpful, or if you belong to a group that you might want to share, please share the video if you found it helpful. And I'll see you next time, hopefully, and thank you for listening.